Hi there, AP Psych class. We are in video number 4 for Unit 3, Biological Basis of Behavior, still talking about the brain. So we are going to advance now beyond the hind and midbrain to the more evolved and complex structures of the human brain. And we're going to start here by just labeling this whole section in general as the forebrain. The forebrain is just going to be where complex functioning occurs. It's actually so large in humans that it's grown over all of the other parts that we've already talked about in our previous video. And so our diagram over on the upper far right is kind of showing you a cross section, and so the forebrain really has, if you look closely towards the bottom, you can see the medulla, the pons, the cerebellum, and you can see how if we hadn't sliced half of this brain away, that we wouldn't even be able to see these things anymore, or very little of these things as a result of our complex brains. So what's included in the forebrain? Let's take a look. The first element here is the thalamus, which is not labeled in the diagram, but would be that pea soup green kind of ovalish shaped thing sitting on top of your pons. It's at the top of the brainstem, and it's your brain's sensory switchboard. Messages coming in from your senses are going to be routed to the proper cortices from the thalamus. It's going to transmit information from the hindbrain and midbrain, so from the medulla and the cerebellum, to the higher levels of the brain. It's helping us make sense of the information coming in from our senses. And so the think thalamus is sensory switchboard. The only sense not routed through the thalamus would be our sense of smell, but more details in Unit 4 about that. The next section of the forebrain we can discuss is the limbic system, which the things labeled on your diagram to the right would represent or encompass the limbic system. The limbic system is really just our connection between old brain and cerebral hemispheres. And so let's talk about its components. The first there, which is in purple on the diagram, is the amygdala. Those are two lima bean-shaped neural clusters that exist in each hemisphere, and they are the connection between primitive or primal emotions like rage and fear, and the communication with the actual higher level thinking that goes either as the trigger or as the calming down in those sorts of situations. And so the amygdala is still kind of this leftover element of primitive brain that is going to deal with like snap reactions or snap judgments. Cats and rats that have had their amygdala stimulated, depends on where, but if electrical stimulation occurs in one area, that animal could go into pure attack mode. And if the electrical stimulation is moved just ever so slightly in one direction or the other, you have that same animal instantly cowering in fear. And so we know that those primal emotions are connected to the amygdala. The hippocampus mentioned there is not really talked about a lot by Myers in your textbook. My guess is that it's because he's going to cover that extensively in our Unit 7 on memory. But the hippocampus, part of the limbic system, you can see it there in light blue. Know that the hippocampus isn't primarily in charge of the formation of new memories. It is not where memories are stored. Those are going to be stored in the cortical regions elsewhere in the cerebrum. But please know that without a hippocampus, you would have the inability to form any explicit memory. So you wouldn't be able to store events or facts, places, names, faces. You wouldn't have any of that information being stored in the rest of the brain without the hippocampus. The next section, hypothalamus, which is there in the bright lime green. The hypothalamus, called this because it's located under the thalamus, is going to be in charge of things such as hunger, thirst, body temperature. Think of it as your thermostat. It's getting its cues from the thalamus, right? That's the switchboard. What are our needs? Like, oh, this room we're in is cold. We need to, grab a jacket, or, up our blood pressure, lower our blood pressure, depending on the situation that we're in. That would be what the hypothalamus is doing. Additionally, it is governing the endocrine system. So you can see that the pituitary gland, which is the main gland that sends messages from brain's requests to the other glands in our body, sits right next to the hypothalamus there. And the hypothalamus is the translator between brain's demands, which are being communicated using neurotransmitters, and the pituitary being able to communicate that to other glands. And so the hypothalamus can speak both languages, so to speak. It can speak neurotransmitter and it can speak hormones. And so it's going to tell the pituitary gland what needs done via endocrine system. The hypothalamus has also been connected to being a pleasure center in the brain. And so we'll actually discuss this when we get into the unit on psychoactive drugs and substance abuse and substance-related disorders, whether or not there's a connection between the size of a hypothalamus and drug addiction. You can see experiments have been done on rats. That's the picture to the left of our brain diagram, where we place a rat in a crate that contains a very painful electrified grid that the rat must cross in order to push a stimulation pedal. And you can see from the wire hanging down from the top that this rat has has an electrical connection directly to its hypothalamus. And because it feels so good to press the stimulation pedal, that rat will walk across that electrified grid hundreds of thousands of times in an attempt to get the high, so to speak, from pressing that pedal. And so to the point of exhaustion or even death. And so more to come as we learn things in neuroscience about perhaps helping people with addictions and whether or not there's a connection to their hypothalamus. Additionally, within the hypothalamus, we do have information regarding specifically where your biological clock lives. And now we talked about some primitive arousal things happening with the reticular formation system in the midbrain, but it would definitely be connected to the suprachiasmatic nuclei within the hypothalamus. So this would be a cluster of cells that are your internal clock, your biological clock, or in the unit on consciousness, we'll discuss it as your circadian rhythm. Okay, continuing on through the forebrain to the part that makes us purely human, the cerebrum. It's divided up into left and right hemisphere. You can see that it's that it surrounds or covers the other components of the brain, and it makes up 85% of our brain's weight. The thing that we like to talk about is the cerebral cortex, or the cortical regions, the cortices of the brain. You might hear them referred to as all three. Those are your interconnected neurocells that cover these two hemispheres. This is your control and processing center. This is where thinking, emotions are occurring. The wrinkly surface of the brain is made up of these fissures and folds. And so if you ever see the words gyri or sulci, right, we're talking about the gyri, think grooves, and the sulci are the humps between the grooves. Being the wrinkled, groovy hills and valleys surface allows us to actually have more surface area in a smaller amount of space. So yay, wrinkly brains mean we don't have giant alien heads that make it hard to walk around because our head's so big and heavy. So yay for that. You can see on the diagram directly to the right on the slide that motor and sensory areas, right, tend to be slightly enlarged as we progress through the animal world until you see the association areas, right? It's the cerebrum that differentiates us from a rat brain or a cat brain and even a chimpanzee brain. The hemispheres that I already mentioned, right, left versus right, we will talk about those further in class, but know that those can be, each hemisphere, left and right, can be divided up into 4 lobes. So let's take a look at those here. Okay, and so the diagram on the right there shows you the division of the lobes and also kind of shows you the left versus right hemisphere of the cerebrum. Okay, and so if we talked about just basics of what each lobe was primarily in charge of. When you think frontal, think planning, judgment, complex muscle movements, right? The motor cortex is going to be located at the back of our frontal lobe. When you think parietal, think touch, think body position. The front of the parietal lobe was going to be the sensory cortex, which we'll get into later. The occipital lobe is located in the back, in pink there on the diagram. Primarily visual fields are being processed in the occipital lobe. The temporal lobe located above your ear, auditory fields. So when you think temporal, think auditory. All right, so any of the areas not being used by the motor or sensory cortex, right, are going to be what we label as association areas. And those are going to be your higher mental functions like learning, remembering, thinking, any complex cognitive task. And so those are very vague generalities, but they'll kind of help you start to identify, again, in general vicinity, where things are occurring in the cerebrum. Okay, a good example of these association areas can be looked at when we talk about language processing. How do you read a language, write a language, speak a language? And so we can talk about how we've learned all of this through cases where people have suffered from aphasia, which is just an impairment of language. And so usually it's involving damage to that left cerebral hemisphere, because we know that it's in the left hemisphere that language is primarily processed. And through patients with aphasia led to our discovery of two association areas in that left hemisphere, Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Named such because, you guessed it, the scientists' last names were Broca and Wernicke. And so Broca's area controls language expression. It directs muscle movement involved in speech. And so you can see that, like, speaking the words, motor cortex, which means that Broca's area is an association area in the frontal lobe near the motor cortex. Wernicke's is association area that controls our reception, comprehension of language. And so we know that that is going to be hearing the words, right? The auditory cortex, which is going to be found in the temporal lobe. And so we'll do some examples of how those work in class, right? But you can see that because of frontal lobe being motor, auditory being in temporal, that kind of shows us where these association areas lie. Okay, so more practice and examples in class. Please bring any questions that you may have with you at that time. Thank you for listening.